Last episode, we sought out the world's oldest song, the world's oldest instrument, and looked at how humans began to try to standardise music. In this part, we'll look at how we took that a step further, creating more sophisticated instruments to spread music far and wide. I'm Charlotte Ritchie, and this is, For the Record, an incomplete history of music. In some ways, the way we make music hasn't changed much at all since the days of prehistoric humans. A voice will always be a voice, and, well, we've always been able to clap. And then, sometimes the best way to make a tune is to simply wander along the beach and scoop up a discarded sea snail's house.
So the conch shell is what's interesting about it is that it taps. So I'm a trumpet player, and the way that you play a conch shell is essentially the same technique as a trumpet, right? So because of this fascination with the early origins of music and why it exists in the first place, the conch shell is a kind of totemic part of that history in a way. And as a trumpet player, it's the most obvious forerunner of the trumpet, really, and brass instruments. So it was, in a sense, quite an easy thing to link to trumpet and to link to the sort of music that I've been making on kind of conventional instruments. But the shells have been played all over the world, really, and they've been really important in all sorts of different cultures. But also, frankly, it's just about the sound. It's just about the raw sound of it is so extraordinary. And when you pick up a shell and that sound comes out, it really stops people in their tracks, I find. And so I have a 3D printed conch shell, because of course I do, and as well as ones from the sea. And the space between those two instruments, so in other words, just picking up a shell and kind of bashing the end off with a rock, which is what our ancestors would have done, and then trying to find a way of playing it, and the 3D printed conch shell. In that space between those things is the entire history of music and the entire history of the iterative process of designing musical instruments.
The bone flutes discovered in Germany that we looked at last episode signified the birth of more complicated instruments. Today, the number of unique types of instruments is surely in the tens of thousands. We're going to start off this episode by taking two common instruments as case studies for the whole evolution of instruments as a whole. We begin with the guitar, an instrument extremely prevalent almost across all genres, from metal to minyo, and all areas of life, from being masterfully played by musical legends in prestigious concert halls to being poorly played by a cringy guy at a beach campfire. It might not be as old as a conch shell, but the guitar's origin is probably a lot older than you'd imagine. And so, like much music history, it's back to Mesopotamia.
This is music that my father grew up listening to in Baghdad, and he absolutely loved it. It's actually the predecessor of all stringed instruments with a neck. So it has a very long, old history. The earliest depiction of the oud was on a cylinder that was found in the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia that was dated around the Akkadian time. And it's a little cylinder of a figure who is holding a longer necked oud, but it has that shape. It's a smaller body and a longer neck, and that's evolved over the years. And around the 6th century, the face, which we now know is wood, was animal skin, most probably sheepskin, and then that was changed to wood. And then the name of al-oud caught on because al-oud means wood. And then it evolved over the years with a lot of cultures and kind of the trade routes and all of that all the way into Europe. And actually the European lute, even etymologically, is the oud. Alud, alut, the lute comes from al-oud. And it's the lute is an instrument in its own right. It has changed a lot too, but that's its predecessor. Before the earlier instruments, stringed instruments, were more like akin to the lyre, which is more akin to the harp. Whereas when you add the neck and you press down, then you're changing the pitch on a single string. It gives a lot more possibilities and colors when you're playing. Because it's so ingrained in the culture, even those who are not musically trained have this level of awe and respect to the oud. It's like it's so common. It's the guitar of the Middle East.
This is the oldest guitar in the world. It was made in 1581. Guitars at the beginning are the Spanish equivalent of what the lute was in Italy. So they were widespread, they were played in different ways. We have evidence that they were played by plucking the strings, by strumming the strings, or even by bowing the strings. They were the typical instrument in Spain at that time. Then gradually, particularly during the 17th century, the instrument starts gaining popularity outside of the Iberian Peninsula, and by the 18th century it gradually replaces the lute completely because it was easier to build. The sound box, the shape, is easier to build than the lute. The neck is the largest single piece of ebony, which I know from an object of this time, and ebony only came from Madagascar. This was typical of a time when strings were made out of gut, animal gut, instead of the more modern materials. This means that the two strings can be tuned on the same note, but there are irregularities in the animal gut, which means that the string will resonate a bit better in certain frequencies of sound or in others, and having two means that the sound is richer. The same that you get today with a 12-string guitar, where strings today are tuned at the octave, but you have a much fuller sound. The time of the big transformation of the guitar is the mid-19th century. Otherwise, until then, what you get is you get more strings. You go from 4 up to the current 6 strings. You get an increase in size and an increase in length of the strings. Then in the mid-19th century, the transformation arrives, mostly in the bracing inside the body of the instrument. So there are elements that you don't see so much. The shape becomes a bit more generous, the curves become a bit more generous. They are transformations that you perceive in a different sound. The sound becomes much bigger. But apart from that, it is an instrument that remains relatively stable throughout its life.
The biggest shift in guitar history would come in 1932, when two men by the names of George Beauchamp and Adolf Rickenbacker invented the electromagnetic pickup. Essentially, these were coils that, when wrapped around a magnet, created an electromagnetic field that then converted the vibrations of their guitar strings into electrical signals, which could then be amplified. The electric guitar had arrived. Initially mostly popular with jazz musicians, the instrument would soon infiltrate all genres, including, most infamously, folk music in 1965 when Dylan went electric. Bob Dylan's performance at the 1965 Newport Folk Festival has, ironically, become a folk story in and of itself, with entire other documentaries devoted to that one afternoon. But that's not this documentary. We've got the entire history of music to cover here, so we've not got time to get bogged down. Bobbed down, thank you, in one solitary thing. So instead, let's get back to this one very specific guitar.
If you look at the back of this instrument, this work, which is obtained by working individual staves of wood and having to bend them in two directions and then assembling them, consolidating the junction with ivory. This is a technique that has absolutely no impact on sound. So it doesn't have any musical reason. It is only there to show how beautiful an object can be and how good the maker was. The maker must have been very proud of this because he signed the instrument twice, at a time when instruments were not signed at all.
As civilization expands, we begin to see that it's not just the sound that we make from instruments that we want to be beautiful, but also the instruments themselves. We love music so much that we want to build objects that reflect that love.
During the Renaissance, musical instruments started becoming objects of beauty and luxury, as well as efficient musical tools. In prehistory, they used bones because they are a natural pipe. They are empty inside, and they are solid, and they are resistant, and they resist to moisture of the breath. These instruments are all from the beginning of the 1700s, so they are about 300 years old. And ivory was an exceedingly expensive material. So you start having makers using ivory just to make incredibly exceptional objects for very wealthy customers. And this is what happens with these instruments. You can see it from the refinement of the decorations. These are clearly not recorders just made to produce a decent sound. They are luxury objects, they are commodities, they are something that you want to show off to your friends while you're performing. And it was the same for the maker, because for a maker, ivory is very tricky to work. It's a bit like soap. It gets hard and soft. Wasting a piece of ivory in the 1700s because you made a mistake would probably have led you to closing the workshop. So you couldn't afford making a mistake, which meant if you were a maker able to make ivory instruments, you were already at the top of the game. You have it in the Italian courts to start with, you have it in the English courts, and then it spreads around Europe. That is the time when musical instruments start being produced not only in much more decorated shapes, but more refined materials, and they start being preserved in collections and to be described in inventories. So there is basically an entirely new concept of what an object is, of the role and the value of objects, and musical instruments are part of this.
Pianos. I had my first lesson at 15.
I think it's great because you can push it to different emotional territory. This is the nuance of the instrument. Listen to the overtones ringing. You see that? That's beautiful. You can do that and move people's soul. And that's really the thing that you want from music. It's a tool to get to deeper things. So that's really what I like. And I think Steinway helps me to get there. So many musical inspirations. Thelonious Monk figured out a way to bend notes on the piano. It's really something. I don't know how he figured that out. Bach, because he was almost inhuman. Duke Ellington.
They are beautiful instruments, no doubt, but not as old as you might imagine.
If we just take the technology of the piano, yeah, that sort of starts if you go back to say 1800, and it's nothing like the Kawais and Steinways, the Yamahas that we have now. It's just the completely different instrument, and the principle might be similar, yeah, but everything about the sound is different.
Yeah, it's always changing and the list is growing.
The first object that you see when you come in the museum is this one, which was made in the 1450s. And it is the oldest keyboard instrument with strings that survives in the world. It is unique. Keyboard instruments, the first thing that one thinks is the piano, of course, but the piano was only invented about 300 years ago, in around the year 1700. This object is a story in its own right. We don't know where it was made, we don't know who made it, we don't know who owned it until much later in time. But there are all sorts of bits and pieces of evidence scattered around the object that tell you stories. There are strips of paper glued inside that come from a legal manuscript written in Ulm in Bavaria in the 1480s. So we know that the instrument has probably been there at some point. We know that the keys were extended in length at some point, which shows that the instrument had shorter keys at the time when single notes were being played, and then they needed longer keys to use all 10 fingers when polyphony was introduced or became more popular. One of the big mysteries is this scenery. We've undertaken all sorts of scientific analysis of the pigments and the materials to try and date them. We haven't reached any conclusive answer. Whether it was original or whether it was a 19th century addition or 18th century addition from a time when the instrument stopped being musically active and became a decorative piece, and someone decided to transform it into a little nativity, is impossible to tell. Or it's impossible to tell yet. We are still working on it and hoping to find something out in the next year or so.
Decorative elements aside, it's a pretty odd-looking harpsichord in its own right. It's upright like a church organ, but the keys are horizontal, like on a normal piano.
Actually, that is very well spotted.
Thank you.
This model must have been exceptional even at the time, and this is probably why it survived. Because there always need to be reasons why a specific object survives and not all the others. The shape might have played a role. It was clearly based on portative organs, which existed at the time, and this shape was not so much justified in the modern upright piano. The shape is justified by saving space in a smaller apartment. In this case, this was not the case. In an organ, you need this shape because the pipes rest vertically on the rest plank, and that's the way the instrument works. And in instruments of this kind, you have a bellow on the back, which you operate with your left hand, while with the other hand you play the keys. So that must have been the reason why this instrument was built with this shape, which was also a huge technical challenge because the action cannot rely on gravity for the jacks to fall back in place after you release the key. So it was more complicated to build.
A complicated instrument, to be sure, but not quite a piano as we know it today. The Royal College of Music in London has the oldest surviving guitar and the oldest surviving keyboard instrument, but the oldest surviving piano in the world, well, that's in Saxony. So we went to Saxony.
Wir haben hier im Leipziger Musikinstrumentenmuseum 6 Tasteninstrumente von Bartolomeo Cristofori, von überhaupt nur weltweit 10 erhaltenen Tasteninstrumenten Cristoforis. Und darunter dieser Hammerflügel, der älteste Hammerflügel überhaupt ist, der in seinem originalen Zustand erhalten ist. Das heißt, der gesamte Tastenumfang und die Mechanik im Inneren des Instrumentes ist niemals verändert worden. Lange Zeit, bis zur Mitte des 18. Jahrhunderts, ist ja eigentlich das Cembalo das verbreitete traditionelle Tasteninstrument gewesen. Der Wunsch bestand allerdings dann schon bald um 1700, den Cembalo-Klang auch dynamisch zu gestalten, also über den Tastenanschlag lauter oder leiser spielen zu können. Und da machte in Florenz Bartolomeo Cristofori, er war Instrumentenbauer am Hofe der Medici in Florenz, er machte die Erfindung, einen Hammerflügel zu bauen, wo also die Saiten nicht angezupft werden mit einem Federkiel, sondern wo ein Hammer die Saiten anschlägt. Und er nannte dieses Instrument Grave Cembalo con pianoforte, also ein großes Cembalo, das eben laut und leise spielen konnte, über den Tastendruck. Dieses Instrument spielt auch noch, aber natürlich über die Jahrhunderte hinweg hat es, weil das Material sich verändert und die Mechanik auch benutzt wurde, hat es nach der Zeit jetzt nicht mehr den originalen Klang. Unsere Idee und Wunsch ist ja nach wie vor, den historischen Klang wieder zu entdecken. Und so haben wir eine exakte Kopie dieses Instruments. Hören wir einmal ganz kurz diesen Hammerflügel, er klingt noch nach Cembalo. Es war Anfang des 18. Jahrhunderts nicht die Idee, ein völlig neues Instrument mit einer völlig neuen Klangästhetik zu schaffen, sondern das Entscheidende war, dem Cembalo-Klang, der ja in die Stilistik des 18. Jahrhunderts hineingehörte, nun die Möglichkeit zu verleihen, laut und leise zu spielen. Also sanften Tastenanschlag oder kräftigen Anschlag.
We've not really mentioned pipe organs up to this point, which predate harpsichords and pianos by some margin, dating back to the 2nd century in Greece, where we think they were originally built to demonstrate the principles of hydraulics rather than as an instrument. Thousands of years later, the sound of an organ has become synonymous with worship, prestigious concert halls, and Joe Cocker intros. They've become more intricate over time, but the principle remains the same, and back in Leipzig, they've got some real fancy ones. We haven't got time to go into all the dynamics and physics of how they work, but it would be wrong not to hear a 250-year-old piece of musical engineering genius.
Da diese kleine Orgel das Rückpositiv einer ehemals größeren war, sollte es auch klangkräftiger klingen, sodass man noch die Klangkrone Prinzipal und Mixtur dazu nehmen kann. Dann haben wir das volle Werk dieses kleinen Instrumentes hier.
music archaeology has done incredible steps forward in recent times. There are always gaps in history, but we have an almost steady number of fragments from 40,000 years ago going on until the end of the 11th century, 12th century. Then you start having an increasing number of surviving instruments. Of course, the first time you see it, you have the excitement of, I am looking at the earliest thing, and it's an immediate instinctive reaction. But then they become questions with stories that you are trying to tackle and understand. So now when I walk in front of it, I think, how can I try to answer the next question that has been there for my past 10 years and I haven't been able to find an answer to? And you start a dialogue with each of the objects that you look after, waiting for them to speak back.
Much like the guitar, the piano too would eventually become electrified, and that leads us to a whole new way of making sound.
So people are driven, forward by technology as well. They're always instrument makers who want to improve something, and they're immediately musicians who want to use it. It just happens totally in tandem.
Well, a piano is effectively a mechanical instrument, lots of strings and hammers that strike them and make them vibrate. This is an electronic machine. Its only real resemblance to the piano is the fact that it uses a conventional keyboard, albeit a much smaller one. This gives us the opportunity to show people sound waves. That's a triangle wave, for example. If I change the oscillator here, that's now the much louder and more aggressive sawtooth wave. And this is called a square wave, despite not looking particularly square on the screen. The first machine I know of to have been called a synthesizer was made in the 1950s, so the mid-50s. An enormous machine, analog electronics, but based on valves, so it was necessarily very large. It kind of filled a room. Looked like a mainframe computer from IBM, say, from the very early days, rather than a musical instrument. It didn't even have a keyboard. You had to program it using paper tape with holes punched to indicate the notes that you wanted to be played. And you fed that into a module of this big machine that was called a sequencer. And we have sequencers to this very day. Sequencers are a key part of electronic music production.
Not as strange as it might sound, because decades before synthesizers, if you wanted to hear a live piano but didn't know anyone who could play one, paper tape and cylinders were the answer.
This is a reproducing piano, and this is an example of the first recordings made on a paper roll by a living pianist. So what I'll play you is a recording by Paderewski, who was probably the most famous pianist at the beginning of the 20th century. It's a paper roll with holes in it. There are a hole for each note it's going to play, and then there are holes at the edge that control the dynamics, because this roll is a proper recording, so you will hear it get louder and softer as he played. And there were pianists who recorded for this Welter system who could have heard Chopin play. That's common to most of these instruments. They are playable as an ordinary piano. This particular one belonged to the royal physician, George V's doctor. They weren't cheap. A Chopin etude in E major, opus 10, number 3, well, with the help of Paderewski.
History and the Musical Museum in West London is littered with self-playing instruments, from tiny, intricate music boxes to big, bizarre boxes of violin. And synthesizers, which is where we were.
Their goal was not to produce a musical instrument that they would sell to musicians. That came later in the 60s, really. But the kind of visionary idea that they had was that they could create technology with which to systematically analyse every hit record of the era, somehow crystallise out of that like a magic formula with which to then generate other guaranteed hit records. That they didn't achieve. But whilst it sounds like alchemy, a slightly crazy idea, the fact is that's what we're seeing happening today with AI, with machine learning, studying the world's archives of recorded music, and generative AI being used to produce new works based on the knowledge the machine now has.
Put that in your back pocket for now. We'll get to AI. Oh, we'll get to AI.
But that's where it started. And by the 60s, we're starting to see companies popping up, creating synthesizers as musical instruments to sell to those musicians who were brave enough to, to take the plunge and start to incorporate these new machines in their work. We went from the 70s, where synthesizers had loads of knobs and sliders and probably lots of wires you could plug in and unplug and so on, to a more kind of menu-driven approach where, almost every band in the charts seemed to at least have a synth. We've got the Human League, we've got Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark, there's Depeche Mode. So many of these bands that decided to throw away the guitars and just use synths. One of the things that changed that made this happen was that they got cheaper. And then I guess there was probably some fashion stuff going on as well. And they sounded amazing. Definitely the sound of the 80s, I think, yeah.
The synthesizer would become a popular instrument incrementally over time. Stevie Wonder was using the older machines in the 1970s, and modern incarnations are present today in almost every genre.
We've got so far to come, but if you open up your heart, you can feel it. Feel this spirit. Whoa, whoa.
Having the knowledge of the instruments has changed how I listen to music. When I first started drumming in a band for the first time, rather than kind of listening from the top down, I would listen from the bottom up, if you know what I mean, and just kind of listening in a slightly different way and noticing different things depending on what I'm focusing on playing. But generally, I think brain-wise, it's all the same. The joy for me has always been like a new challenge and figuring it out and seeing what I can do with it. So yeah, I reckon I could give it a good go anyway. Just like, oh, how does this work? Okay, cool, now I'm gonna, try and make it sound good if I can.
At the dawn of music, if you wanted to hear someone perform, you had to be in the same cave as them. As civilizations crop up, there's performances in royal courts and the like, but with more and more instruments and more people playing them, there comes a desire to be able to share that music outside your local community. And one of the first ways that we do that is with notation via sheet music.
Und das ist ein sehr typisches ein Ausschnitt, ein typisches Blatt aus einem Choralbuch. Das heißt, in dem Falle noch handgeschrieben, aber so großformatig, dass man von einem Blatt herumstehend mit mehreren Sängern auch aus großer Entfernung auf dieses Blatt schauen konnte und diese Hymnen, die gregorianischen Choräle singen konnte.
The problem with handwriting is it takes ages. Thankfully, printing technologies were right around the corner.
So what do we think of as printed music, really? What do we think of as printing? Printing means mechanically reproducing in multiple copies something. When we think of the beginning of printing text, we think of Gutenberg, 1450, printing the Bible with individual pieces of type that you can then take apart. So if we think of that technology being applied to printing, we always cite the first kind of example as from 1470. It's a gradual, so it's something for the church, with liturgical music, where actually individual pieces of notes have been printed on lines. So there you have this kind of letterpress idea applied to music. Well, music is slightly more complicated to print than text, because of course you need lines and you need notes on top. So originally everything that's printed in music in that kind of letterpress way is done at least 2 runs of the paper through the press. So in the first run you print the lines, and on the next run you print the notes on top, and it has to be really accurate, because if it's a few millimeters out you have a different notation, you have a different music. So really when you think more of a commercially viable way is when you get to 1537 and you get single impression printing. So each piece of type has some lines and 1 note, and you can put them together like you can put together text without needing to run it through the press multiple times.
Das war eine Innovation, weil auf diese Weise auch Noten sehr schnell verbreitet werden konnten, vervielfältigt werden konnten.
That is much uglier. It's super wobbly, but of course economically much more viable, because you can do that quickly and you take it apart, and from then on is really when we feel printing will eventually start to get slightly cheaper. We have to think about the fact that paper is still the most expensive commodity. Why we often cite 1501 as a big sort of turning point in printing music is because you get the first thing where you might call a classic music book. So a full book full of individual pieces of music that isn't a liturgical book that has music as part of the liturgy in it, like not a mass book. And this is Petrucci in Venice, 1501, and that's why we call it often the birth of music book. Technologically, it was all there. They had already printed liturgy in the same way, but he now prints polyphonic music with movable type in a kind of music book in 1501.
As we touched on in last episode, in indigenous populations such as Australia, music is shared not by writing it down, but purely by oral transmission. And as this music journeyed across the continent, it served as a literal guide. Songlines, in a rudimentary sense, are in fact navigation by song.
Songlines comes in many different descriptions. To us, it links place to place. You can sing of how you get from one place to another, and it talks about all the features in between, the pools, the trees, the hills, the rocks. So you'd sing from place to place. So you've got song lines are many streams. It's not just one stream. It's a road map in one part, so I can sing from here into Perth to say, as I'm going to Perth, you'd sing the song about how the river is here, and you'd follow the river line, and you'd come to a place where there's a crossing. So that'll give you that link, and when you're singing that, it takes you on the journey. So what a songline does is link you from one place to another, and the significant places that are between those. So the songline would go to there, then that's a songline itself. Then you'd get to a border area where there's a shared place. So we had borders where we were shared, and not, this is Whadjuk and this is Balladong. We'd have it so that the Whadjuk and Balladong came together, and we'd have that shared song. So I'd sing as a Whadjuk to the Balladong area, then the Balladong people sing the same song, but they'd take that song then to the Nudgy people. So you'd have the link of that, and then they'd take it into the Wongai in the desert area. So you'd have people knowing their song lines, but together we're all linked up and knitted into one, because you have your border language. So that what that does, you're connecting one country at a time. We can't sing from here to Queensland, we've got to sing our way through. So by the time you get to Queensland, it's a completely different language, but the language is changed one bit at a time because there's a borderline that's linking. But at the same time, it's not as simple as that. When you get to a specific place, that's a song itself, because when you're going that way, you're also going that way. And what we have in our culture, we don't just have the north, south, east, west. We have also up and down. So into the land, the subterranean, the old water, the roots of the trees, what's under the ground, but also the skyline. That's into the songs as well. So we sing about the stars, we sing about those elements that also can link you. So whilst we're singing physically here, of going from the ocean to the hill, we can also be singing from the Milky Way star, following that as well. So that gives you that guidance. So as you can see, it's quite sophisticated, and it's a lifetime of study. So you've got all these connects that are mapping different genres of music and song. It is drawing a map of place, but it's also drawing a map of purpose, a map of people, a map of the plants and animals.
Oral traditions exist in Western society too, of course, where people gather together to hear songs and stories. It's just that these days they often involve non-refundable booking fees. Printed music was obviously incredibly important in the distribution of music and enabled people to gather in their homes to hear music and sing together, but that still requires someone who knew how to read it and then play it. But a few decades later, some very clever folk stumbled on the ability to record sound.
Galileo just made some really interesting, he was one of the first human beings to make some really interesting observations about the way sound waves interacted with the physical environment. And he described how he was working with a chisel, and how when he hit a chisel on this sort of brass, it sort of vibrated in a certain way. And then he noticed that the dust was forming little lines and sort of seemed to be dancing around to a definite pattern. And that became the starting point for a whole, for centuries of study in the way that sound waves interact with the environment.
In fact, the oldest ever recorded sound is actually musical, a fragment of the French folk song Au clair de la lune, sung by the inventor Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville in 1860. He'd invented a device that etched sound waves onto paper, but it was purely for visual analysis because there was no way of playing it back. But in 2008, the first sounds collaboration finally made his recording audible. And it is totally not creepy at all. It is arguable that nothing in the history of music has had more impact on the expansion of the art form than what I'm surrounded by right now: the record. Their life began way back in 1877 with Thomas Edison's invention of the phonograph. Now, that was a primitive invention by the standard of today's record players, but the science and technology at its core was not dissimilar. It had two foil-coated cylinders able to both record and play back sound via a hand-operated crank. It was completely revolutionary and paved the way for recording and distributing music for generations to come.
Well, I think the thing to remember with Edison is that it was an accidental byproduct of what he was working on. So he was working essentially on a new type of telephone. That was one of the things that him and his team of engineers in Menlo Park, New Jersey, were working on. And during some various experiments, he was holding the mouthpiece of a telephone and just sort of bellowing into it, singing into it, and feeling the way the diaphragm vibrated against the palm of his hand. And he sort of turned to his chief engineer, Charles Batchelor, and said, if we got a point on this diaphragm and then pulled something beneath it while we're talking, then we should be able to pull it through again and we'd get the sound, it would record the sound and give it to us back. And they all just sort of went, oh, I think that should work. And that day, it was July 18th, 1877, they rigged up what's known as a strip phonograph. This was a very, very early prototype, which was essentially just a small device that you pulled wax-covered paper through. And that day they tried it. He shouted, hello, hello, while pulling this wax-covered paper through, then pulled it through again. And while it would be wrong to say they heard a perfect hello, hello, they did hear a sort of raspy buzzing that was recognisable as being the human, you know, the voice that he had just said. So they didn't drop everything and think, quick, let's make a record player. And it wasn't until the end of the year, so that was in July, but it wasn't until December that they went public, as it were, with what became known as the phonograph or talking machine, which used tinfoil. You know, he was interested by it. He wrote, you can tell by the way he wrote about his discovery, he was definitely excited by it, but they didn't really know what they could do with it. And they originally were just thinking about it in a kind of, it could be used in telegraphy as a way to record and then pass on a sort of message. That's what was in their mind. But when they eventually went public with the phonograph, the reaction to it was huge. People were so excited, and one of the key things they were excited about was not music, it was about the idea that they could record the voices of their loved ones for posterity and possibly hear them again. Again, quite, you know, it's quite similar to photographs, as in, you know, the Victorian era had seen it become the norm that people could take a photograph of their loved ones to preserve them forever. And people were excited about the idea of being able to capture the tones of the voices of their loved ones.
As the phonograph took off, Edison and his friends refined it, eventually replacing the tin foil, which sounded, well, tinny, with a wax cylinder.
Basically, he realised that if you record with the sound travelling down a horn, it waggles a cutting needle. In his case, it waggles up and down. And he had a wax cylinder and a screw that carried the needle across the cylinder, and a groove on the cylinder carried the sound. You know, it was the wave on the cylinder was the same as the sound waves. To play it back, you just put a needle into that groove, it waggles a diaphragm and the sound comes out, as I will demonstrate. Clockwork motors, big spring. Not the finest quality in the world, but
The cylinders were doing okay in the 1890s. The grandfather of the disc-shaped record is really Emil Berliner, and he had been experimenting with discs. And the reason he'd been experimenting with discs was because he envisaged being able to make a copy from one recording. Now, the early cylinders, you couldn't do that. To make 10 copies of a record, you had to perform that song 10 times. And that's what they did. It seems staggering, but they sold thousands of records with these poor performers endlessly singing their number one hit over and over again. But Emil Berliner was working on this sort of stamper technology, roughly like we still make records today, where you could make a single master recording and stamp out loads of copies. So even though his first disc-shaped records, which were actually made of a kind of weird hardened rubber, even though they sounded pretty bad, they weren't as good as cylinders, the fact that you could stamp out hundreds of copies from a single master just meant they were so much cheaper to produce. Then, when he hit upon shellac from working with a company called Duranoid in New Jersey in 1895, that's when he figured, that's when the magic all came together, because it was quickly, the records sounded so much better. And from that moment on, although cylinders and records coexisted, you know, the writing was on the wall for cylinders. They dragged on to, I think, till 1927 or something, cylinders were still being made. But the writing was on the wall by that point.
Phonographs are a huge leap forward. But once the flat disc comes into production, Berliner's gramophone soon follows. The first records are made from shellac, a natural resin. Vinyl takes over as the material of choice by the 40s and remains the standard for records today.
You will always be my necessity. I'd be lost without you. You're the star.
The switch from shellac to vinyl occurred for many reasons, not least because shellac was an essential ingredient in making explosives, which were in high demand in the early 40s. Based on Edison's discoveries, you could technically record on anything, really. Metal, wood, wax, this book, for example. So why vinyl?
It has to be certain things. So one is this, it's a mass market communication medium, right? Via a material, which is vinyl in this case. So it's got to be cheap. So plastics, and that's what vinyl is, it's a plastic, win. But not all plastics will work, because when you're putting, in this case, a diamond tip into some grooves, Well, you can imagine that if it's a very soft plastic, that all the diamond tip is going to do is basically wear its own groove and completely obliterate that. So it's got to be hard, right? And it's got to be able to be handleable, and if you throw it on the floor, not shatter. So it's got to be tough. So it's got to be hard, tough plastic. And then the other thing it has to be is, when this phrase, you can cut a record. It literally is the microphone cutting into a groove on a real material. And so when you make a record from that groove, you actually basically you heat it up, you press it into it, and that then imprints it. So it's got to be moldable. So moldable, tough, and hard plastic. And PVC is pretty much, it's always a compromise, but PVC is kind of it. Well, this is one of the miracles of sound. Like, sound is vibrations in the air, so it's different densities of air molecules, and that's how we hear sound. And so that, you can think of that as a wave pattern. So high density, let's say, is a peak, and low density is a valley. And so you're maybe used to seeing these wave patterns when people record things on a microphone.
We're very used to the idea of microphones in air, and what microphones are is a wobble detector. That these wobbles in the air come through the air, they hit a microphone, and a microphone is a thing that translates those wobbles into electrical signals that we can record or play back or amplify or whatever we're going to do.
Now, imagine you take that wave pattern and you basically make it into a tiny little indentation in this groove of this record. Well, could that possibly work if you then, in reverse, put a little needle on it and go up and down those valleys and peaks? But yes, it does. It recreates the low density, high density pressures in the air, which we hear as music.
I mean, this encapsulates exactly why I'm still so obsessed with records and why I love writing about them and talking about them. Is because there's still a part of my brain that doesn't understand how it can be that, I understand the concept that sound waves are basically funneled down and then carved into the grooves. But how can it just be, it's just a bumpy sort of valley. How can it sound like the Beatles? But that's also its great power, because it is just a solid artifact, a solid physical object, sound waves imprinted in something solid.
Put your records on, tell me your favorite song. You go ahead, let your head down.
That is the beauty of material like vinyl, because you take a song or some speech, and those are kind of pressure waves, and and it's recorded and cut into it as the highs and lows, a wave function of those pressure wave. And it's actually a physical groove in there. And the physical groove, if you can pick it up, and this is just a pin here I put on a cone of paper, which I'm going to use to be an amplifier, this will vibrate at the original frequency that those were recorded at. And so it will then be mechanically amplified by the cone. And you should hear the music, because there is no encoding. It is just a one-to-one mechanical translation. And that is magic, isn't it? I'm having trouble guiding it along the groove, which is done via this kind of quite clever mechanical mechanism, which has got a counterbalance. And once it's in the groove, it goes. And I'm having difficulty. Also, I've only got a pin, literally a needle from a sewing kit here. And so it's much blunter than the diamond on this.
Physical media has been through its changes, but today, after Edison phonographs, wax cylinders, CDs, cassettes, laserdiscs, mini discs, DVDs, and whatever else you want to mention, vinyl still remains. It's the format that has stuck around, perhaps because of the unique sound that you get from a vinyl record. Maybe because we value being able to see album art as more than just an icon on a screen. Because some album art, let's be honest, is just too iconic to be just an icon. Perhaps it's because a record, much like a book, is just a pleasing physical object. Whatever the reason, 150 plus years after the technology was invented, the humble record remains, and it shows no signs of going away.
I grew up with vinyl. I grew up with that tactile thing of taking LPs, taking records to a party to show who you were, to show your personality, and maybe to show off a little bit about your musical taste, you know? And then insisting that only you would put the record on so it didn't get scratched, right? And nobody else is allowed to touch it or get fingerprints on it. So, I mean, I started off with vinyl, and then moved on to CD because CD was handy, it was convenient, it was small, you didn't have to turn the record over every 20 minutes. I do stream during lockdown. I bit the bullet and bought a streamer. So in this room, I've got two different systems for whether I'm listening to CDs and LPs or whether I'm streaming. I just turn the chair around. I've only got 3 chairs in this room because I've only got 2 friends who listen to records with me. It's true, absolutely true. But it's something about, you know, all the information that's there, the artwork is phenomenal, just the feel of it, the smell of it. You find out who produced the album, you sometimes get the lyrics with it. You miss out on a lot of that if you're streaming. And also with me, now that I'm older, CDs, if I buy a CD, I can't always read the writing without a magnifying glass.
It's a bit like there was a wonderful act called Woody Bot Muddy, his real name William Wilding, who used to be in a band called the Native Hipsters, and now the Native Hipsters, who had a kind of independent hit with a wonderful song called Look, There Goes Concord Again. And he then did this act called Record Graveyard. This was in the early 90s, and he used to, he'd come on, he'd go, Record Graveyard, will this go to Record Heaven or Record Hell? And he would play it, and then the audience would vote Record Heaven or Record Hell. If it went to Record Heaven, he would wipe the vinyl against a picture of some kittens. If it went to Record Hell, Record Graveyard rather, he would then nail it to a plank of wood and smash it to pieces. I actually saved, we were gigging together in Dundee, and he was about to smash Pinky Blue by Altered Images, and I stopped that happening. But yeah, then there was a sudden point, it stopped working. Just almost, it felt like overnight, and it was because vinyl had disappeared, and all the students who loved it, in, I don't know what it was, 97, 98, suddenly it lost all cultural relevance, which was quite interesting.
So vinyl is the best of all possible worlds for me. And I was so glad when it made its comeback.
I was never a huge fan of cassettes. The CD arrived in, I think it was 82. We've actually got the first CD that Philips issued in the cabinet there, alongside a piano roll by the same artist, recorded in the 20s. So that spans a few formats.
The fidelity, I mean, arguably this is much better than most digital recordings because digital recordings either record a yes or a no, a 1 or a 0. So they kind of emulate the full range, but actually there are these little steps. So it's the difference between a set of stairs going up a mountain and the full range of curvature, right? If you think of that as an analogy.
A few decades later, on Christmas Eve in 1906, the inventor Reginald Fessenden takes a recording of Handel's Largo and, using a combination of an alternator and a rotary spark gap transmitter, broadcasts it over the air. Radio had arrived. By 1920, the first public broadcast takes place in the US, and shortly after, here in the UK, the British Broadcasting Company is born.
Well, broadcasting in Britain starts in 1922 with the BBC, but to begin with, there's only a pretty small number of people who are able to listen, about 150,000. By 1939, in the beginning of the war, there are 34 million people able to listen. We're on a par, roughly speaking, with Europe. America got ahead of the game, but America had no or very little regulation. And the key thing about broadcasting in the UK was it was quite highly regulated, for better or for worse, which meant that in its earliest days it was a monopoly, so everybody was listening to the same thing. From the earliest days there were hours to fill, and therefore, although there was a lot of spoken word, there was also the insistence on entertaining, and to fill the hours there was a lot of gramophone music played.
From a nuisance, radio progressed to become a novelty. Earphones gave way to loudspeakers, and you could actually hear music by radio in your own living room.
There was music played in the studio and sung in the studio, small bands and pianos and singers, but there were also a lot of live transmissions from places like the Savoy Hotel, for example, right in the heart of London. So the increase in the amount of music that people heard was absolutely phenomenal. So there was quite a lot of more serious classical music, and on Sundays there was nothing but serious classical music. But it became clear from very early on that radio was a two-way street, and the listeners wouldn't listen if they wouldn't get the kind of thing that they really wanted. And therefore there was more and more what was known as light music. There was jazz, there was all sorts of variety as well. And really excitingly, very early on, all sorts of new music, a lot of it coming from America, expanded people's knowledge unimaginably. So in the early 1920s, for example, the first ever performance in Britain of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which is one of the great bits of music of the 20th century, was performed with Gershwin at the piano for the first time on BBC Radio. So imagine the excitement. If all you had were a few records, imagine the excitement then of hearing something that so expanded your knowledge of music. I think right from the start, the people who ran radio realised the immense power and influence they had, and I think also an understanding that they were gatekeepers, if you like, to a vastly increased size of audience. So there was a bit of a moral panic that if people heard music on the radio, they would stop making it themselves. And with some instruments, there was a little truth in that. There was a bit less learning of the piano, for example. But in other ways, an increased number of people began to hear music and want to play it themselves. There was also a lot of anxiety amongst performers, both musicians and other entertainers, comedians and so on, that material they had, which they had toured across the country before there was radio, and which might have lasted them a whole season, suddenly would go in a single broadcast. So there was a lot of debate among musicians and performers whether it was or was not in their interest. And the most famous example in Britain is Gilbert and Sullivan operettas were very popular, but the D'Oyly Carte Company initially refused to give permission for their operettas to be performed because they felt that they would lose out that way. In time that was negotiated, and now to this day you can hear Gilbert and Sullivan on the radio, but there was an understanding that there was a downside as well as an upside.
I am a pirate king, and it is a glorious thing to be a pirate king, for I am a pirate king, a pirate king, and it is a glorious thing to be a pirate king.
Radio and gramophones work hand in hand as the #1 way people around the world hear new music from elsewhere around the world. And if you don't like the music of the major broadcasters are giving you, then there's pirate radio. I mean, not this sort of thing, but you know what I mean. In the next episode, we take a look at the origins of some of the early types of recorded music, such as classical and opera. With the arrival of recordings, less and less of the music on the radio is being played live, and more is being played off disc, as music truly enters the vinyl frontier. I mean, technically, in the really early days, it would have still been shellac, or even been leftover foil cylinders of some recordings, but that doesn't really work as a pun, does it? The tin frontier. No. Oh my, okay, HMS tinfoil, tinafoil. Nailed it.
Sometimes when this place gets kind of empty, sound of their breath fades with the light. I think about the loveless fascination under the Milky Way tonight. Lower the curtain down on Memphis. Lower the curtain down, alright. I got no time for private consultation under the Milky Way tonight. Wish I knew what you were looking for. Might have known what you would find. And it's something quite peculiar, something shimmering and white. Will lead you here despite your destination under the Milky Way tonight. Wish I knew what you were looking for. Might have known what you would find. Wish I knew what you were looking for. Might have known what you would find. And it's something quite peculiar, something shimmering and white. Leads you here despite your destination